Hi, it's Ray. Welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new. It is the end of November, which means it is acceptably time to start getting excited about Christmas and getting in the Christmas spirit. I adore this time of year. I love Advent. It just feels like such an extension of Christmas for me, and I'm really excited that it's almost December. I think November for so many people is such a miserable month. I often find it is for me. It's like I always think of Narnia, and that's always winter but never Christmas thing that the White Witch curses the land with. November kind of feels like that because Christmas is too far away. But now Christmas is nearly here, so I wanted to share an eclectic mixture of books that put me in the mood for Christmas and that are close to my heart as books that I have read around this time of year or feel are great books to read around this time of year. So let's get straight into it. First book that I have is Little Women by Louisa Alcott. This is not a controversial pick for a book to read around Christmas. It literally begins, "Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents," grumbled Jo, lying on the rug. And it's famously the March sisters, a family of 4 girls living with their mother, Mommy, and their father is away during the Civil War in America. I know it's kind of been in the spotlight because there was a fantastic film of it that came out about this time last year. One of the main reasons that I think this is such a perfect novel to read around this time of year, it's super comforting, it's really cozy, but most importantly I think it kind of encapsulates those Christmas spirit values of generosity, of love, of family, of caring for one another. And that runs throughout the book, even though the book is not at all set exclusively at Christmas. I think those values run quite blatantly throughout the book. It's a bit old-fashioned in that sense. It can be a bit moralizing. Maybe some of those morals you won't 100% agree with anymore, but I think overall this is a book which is super easy to love, super comforting to read, beautifully written. My other favourite thing about this book actually is its description of transitioning from Christmas back to everyday life in January. Very early on there's a scene where all the girls have to go back to work after Christmas and they're grumbling and moaning and just generally feeling sorry for themselves and feeling really miserable about having to go back to day-to-day life, and that scene always really helps me with those post-Christmas blues. It kind of makes me appreciate how universal that sentiment of post-Christmas misery is and how it's been the case throughout history. So yeah, it's also a nice book to take with you into the new year. This is a super old edition. As you can see, it was my mum's, and it's got a lovely red Christmassy hardcover, which I love. Kind of continuing in a similar vein of cozy, beautifully written classic literature, but with a significantly lesser known classic. My next recommendation, which is the book closest to my heart out of all of these, this is my gorgeous folio edition, The Country Child by Alison Uttley. She wrote around the same time as Enid Blyton. Apparently she wasn't a particularly nice woman and she was extremely bitter of Blyton's success. But that does not take away from the fact that her own writing is gorgeous, absolutely stunning. The editions of The Country Child, I know this is a kind of fancy edition, but even my old cheap edition. This is my original copy, 30p. It has the like wood cutting drawings. I think they're in all the editions of it, which are gorgeous. The Country Child is a semi-autobiographical book about a young girl, Susan Garland. She's 8 years old, growing up in the countryside in Derbyshire at the end of the 19th century. She is a really interesting character. She's extremely introverted, imaginative. She's an only child. She lives in this very lonely world on the farm. And this book takes you through a year in her life, chapter by chapter. So each chapter is kind of a little vignette of an aspect of Susan's life. So like one of them is called Trees, and it talks about her relationship with trees, one for the harvest. But the reason that I love this at Christmas time is that its chapters, one is called December, which is a gorgeous Advent, kind of Christmas Eve sort of chapter, and one is Christmas. They are stunningly written. I used to read these chapters to myself, the December one on Christmas Eve and the Christmas one on Christmas morning in bed when I inevitably woke up at like 4 a.m. and wasn't allowed to get up for hours because I used to wake up so early on Christmas morning. I actually am one of the rare adults I know who still does. Like I still wake up at 6 a.m. on Christmas morning. I just love Christmas Day so much. The writing is absolutely stunning. Okay, reading out of my edition that's not falling to pieces in my hands. To take you from the end of the December chapter into the beginning of Christmas Day. Christmas Eve was nearly over, but tomorrow was Christmas Day, the best day in all the year. She shut her eyes and fell asleep. Christmas Day. Susan awoke in the dark of Christmas morning. A weight lay on her feet, and she moved her toes up and down. She sat up and rubbed her eyes. It was Christmas Day. She stretched out her hands and found the knobby little stocking, which she brought into bed with her and clasped tightly in her arms as she fell asleep again. She awoke later and lay, holding her happiness, enjoying the moment. The light was dim, but the heavy mass of the chest of drawers stood out against the pale walls, all blue like the snow shadows outside. She drew her curtains and looked out at the starry sky. She listened for the bells of the sleigh, but no sound came through the stillness except the screech of Owl's call. Again, she hadn't caught Santa Claus. Of course, she knew he wasn't real, but also she knew he was. It was the same with everything. People said things were not alive, but you knew in your heart they were. That kind of gives you a taste of the writing in here. I think it's kind of making me tear up just reading that chapter because it's so nostalgic for me and it's so beautiful, and I just think it captures the joy of Christmas. Okay, now for the obvious. You can't have a list of suggested reads for Christmas without mentioning A Christmas Carol. I have got this beautiful edition that my aunt bought me. Actually, this whole video is a little bit inspired by my aunt because she always has the most tasteful, beautiful Christmas decorations in her house. And when I went to visit last year, I noticed that one thing she had is a kind of special little shelf of Christmas books, which are just out in a prominent place so that you can kind of browse them, pick them up, just see them around and kind of interact with them over the Christmas period. I thought that was the loveliest idea, which I 100% intend to replicate with the books that I have talked about in this video. And Christmas Carol will take pride of place because it is for sure my most beautiful and Christmassy looking book. A bit like Little Women, even more so than Little Women, Christmas Carol is obviously incredibly famous. It's the story of Scrooge, who's a miserly, miserable old man who gets visited, haunted by 3 ghosts on Christmas Eve, and from those hauntings he kind of reflects on who he is as a person and takes on board some of the positive moral changes that we all should be associating with at Christmas time. Also in this book, and also in most copies of A Christmas Carol, are many of Dickens' other Christmas stories, which I have never read, but which I know my mum, who is a massive Dickens fan, also says are for sure worth reading. Like culturally, the values of the ghosts, the changes that Scrooge affects in his life because of them, being more generous, being more loving, being kind, being joyful. All of those things are really embodied in this book. The writing is beautiful, descriptive, rich, as Dickens always is. It's imaginative, it's fantastical, and it is just quintessentially Christmas. Go back in time for my next recommendation, which is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is the book that kind of made me put Eclectic in the title of this video, because it's obviously lesser known if you haven't studied English, which I did. This was my kind of academic copy, but I adore this poet. The poet who wrote this, he's referred to as the Gawain poet. He's anonymous, nobody knows what he was called, but he is for sure my favourite Middle English writer, like well above Chaucer. The Gawain poet was writing in the late 14th century, so a long time ago, and he was from Cheshire in the UK. So it's written in Middle English, like Chaucer, but it's actually a lot harder to read because it's kind of a more northern dialect of Middle English. It's completely different to Chaucer, I think, whereas with Chaucer, you can pretty much read it without a translation. That is not so much the case for Sir Gawain the Green Knight, so this is my academic copy. Got a facing page translation. That is what the language looks like. So it has, you know, for example, it has like this letter, which is called thorn. It makes the sound of TH in modern English. I don't really know why we got rid of it, because it's quite a useful letter. It tells the story of Sir Gawain, and on New Year's Eve, he is at a party with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and in comes this massive green knight, a giant who's green in colour, and he kind of dares somebody to play the beheading game with him, where he says, you can have my axe and you can strike me a blow, but the deal is that in a year I can return the blow to you. And everybody's terrified for Arthur, that this is going to be the death of King Arthur, so noble Gawain steps up and says, I will take on the challenge. And the story is pretty dramatic. It goes on from there to show the blow that Gawain gives to the Green Knights, but then mostly to look at, in a year's time, Gawain's quest to re-find the Green Knight so that he can honour his side of the bargain, and the time that he spends around the area where the Green Knight lives in this sort of mystical, mythical castle. This is extremely fantastical, a very dreamlike sort of quality to the language. Also just absolutely fascinating. What I love about this book and why I threw it in for Christmas is that on the one hand it is super Christian, it kind of bangs on about Christian values, but at the same time you can really sense that this book comes from a time that was more closely connected to the pagan than the society that we live in today. There's a real kind of feeling of Yule throughout the manner in which the celebrations take place here. Just the character of the Green Knight himself is very a pagan, ancient, demigod kind of figure. The main thing that I love about this is, in spite of the fact that the language is hard to read, it is just so evocative because it's written with alliterative poetry, which was traditionally the form of poetry in English. The rhyming style that we associate more closely with poetry today came in from Europe, more like from France, from Italy, and that is obviously what Chaucer uses, but the Gawain poet still sticks to the more Old English Beowulf style of writing, where what ties the poetry together is the alliteration, and I think it just creates such a rich, dense, textured language to the poetry. Like alliterative poetry to this day is still my favourite. It's like Gerard Manley Hopkins, those kind of poets are the ones that I really love. I find alliterative poetry so rich and beautiful, and this is very much the case for Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. There are a lot of gorgeous descriptions which really capture the closeness with which people of that time lived with nature and with the seasons, the warmth of the celebrations inside the castles, but the painful cutting cold and danger and misery of the weather outside is beautifully and uniquely captured in this poem. Okay, my last recommendation, I'm putting this last because this is, of all the books, this is the one that I enjoyed the least, but I still think it's a really nice Christmassy book and the concept is great. I don't have it because I lent it to somebody in the UK, but the book is The Christmas Mystery by Jostein Gaarder, who is the author who wrote Sophie's World, which is definitely his most famous work. He's Norwegian. Sophie's World is a kind of journey through the history of philosophy, which, if you've read it, there's definitely massive similarities between that and The Christmas Mystery in terms of the frame narrative. So in Sophie's World, you have the frame narrative of this girl Sophie who receives these mysterious letters which tell her all about the history of philosophy, and in this book, The Christmas Mystery, there's a little boy who gets given an advent calendar, and the advent calendar is kind of magical, and each day of the advent calendar contains a letter which tells the story of this little girl, Elizabeth, who was shopping in Norway on Christmas in the 1920s and then mysteriously disappeared. And it tells the story of each day she travels kind of physically on a journey across Europe, but also in time, back in time, eventually towards being present at the Nativity. So that's the kind of concept of the book. Each chapter is an Advent day, which I think is just a really lovely concept. It makes it a nice book to read throughout Advent. I actually found the story really gripping in the beginning, but I didn't feel like Jostein Gaarder did as much with it as he could have done. Like, it gets a bit repetitive. I can totally imagine it's the sort of book that could easily be a Christmas ritual for a family, of reading a chapter of this book every day, and that would be gorgeous. Even a personal Christmas ritual of reading a chapter every day is quite a Christian-linked book. So in that sense feels very traditionally Christmassy, and yeah, it's just another book which I recommend, especially for the Advent period, as it is literally an Advent book. Those are 5 of my recommendations for great books to read around this time of year to get yourself excited for Christmas. I hope that if you read any of them that you enjoy them. I hope you have a wonderful Advent period. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.